Hi everyone, good morning if you're joining me at school for tutor time, and welcome to Arts Week. This year our title is going to be Documenting Life, and we're going to be looking very particularly at how artists see and record in the human world. For those of you who were in school with me last year, you'll remember our theme was hands. And we looked at how hands symbolise so much more than their physical representation can show us. And I would say actually that's true of all forms of anything we see. And of course, art is dealing in the currency of things we see. And therefore, everything available to art and artists is something that can be not just transformative, but also highly symbolic. I would like us to think about how art records all life. There's a link between actions, ideas, and images. So an artist experiences something, and then somehow that experience comes out through the art they make. And that's not always an obvious thing, but it is something that particularly historians, archaeologists, people who study ancient cultures, for example, look back at when they study ancient art. On the screen now, the starter slide you can see is one of the images you would have seen last year, or indeed for those people who study with me, particularly Year 7, I would have shown you this kind of image when we were looking at the importance of art and where art comes from. It's a spit painting, and it's a gathering of hands, and it shows us that even in our Paleolithic ancestors, there was still a need for people to make permanent something that is perhaps impermanent, a sense of togetherness. So, as form is so often symbolic, every image has a story. Even if a story or a narrative isn't the main focus within the painting or sculpture or photograph, the fact is that there's a story behind why that thing has been made. And the stories we find usually link into the culture of the artist, the place the artist is from, the age the artist is, the age the artist comes from, so the period in history in which they exist. This year, we're going to explore, as I said, how art records the way we live, who we are, what we do, and what our fears, hopes, and dreams might be. That's a bit more abstract, perhaps. And there could be questions that arise about what we think our time now will look like to an audience of the future. So if we're saying that artists definitely do take the experiences of now and they funnel that into the art they make, I wonder what our art will look like, and also indeed how it will be interpreted and perceived well into the future when our descendants maybe uncover some archive of hidden drawings or concealed paintings or lost sculptures. In the contemporary world, so the world now, human connections are rather compromised. They could also be enhanced, but certainly altered because of how we feel and how we respond and react during the coronavirus pandemic. We're going to inquire into the nature of our human need to belong and what that looks like as an art representation. We're also going to think about what it means to gather in groups, especially at a time in which gathering in groups is really not allowed. And also to be part of something bigger, to be part of something that is unified. And it is something interesting in human nature that where we want to belong often, we also somehow rally against that. Humans are strange and complex, and our art represents that too. There's always a sense that we switch between a kind of powerful unity and also some sort of destructive divisiveness. And if we imagine any painting, photograph, sculpture, any form of visual art as a window into our world, think how many images we'll see in which mask wearing will be obvious, or something about our fear-stricken society might somehow become overt. Think about how artists take what we live now and turn it into visual outcomes. So if you're with me in school, and you're looking this morning at this as a kind of series of small tasks, I'd like you to get out a notebook, perhaps your well-being diary or your rough book. And I'd like you to annotate the questions that you see here as kind of responses. Discuss as a class. Discuss with your tutors. Think about this amongst yourselves. And for those of you not in school who just want to do this anyway, then I encourage you to jot down your feelings about these questions, the responses you will give. What will the future audience think about us and our culture? Can we even imagine that far ahead? What will our descendants focus on in the lives of us, their ancestors? When they see what we make now, when they think back, when they look at us backwards through the tunnel of time, how are they going to perceive what it's like to live in 2020? And I particularly want us to think that if art is a language that communicates our world today to the people of tomorrow, what our world today is really going to look like. I mean, on the screen now you can see just two images I pulled from the internet. One is of I think it's a soccer game in New Zealand. You can see the stand there, almost completely empty. People observing as much as they can, some kind of social distancing. We could think about that in many of the news photographs we see of places that are otherwise usually full and bustling, absolutely teeming with human life, how they've become silent spaces, places where nobody goes or where people go and they have to then feel very isolated within places where they would otherwise experience togetherness. And then the other image down on the bottom is someone fumigating somewhere to disinfect it or to sanitize it so that the spread of COVID is somehow curtailed. We see, again, lots of images like this when we're looking at how we basically clean up after ourselves, how we make sure that we contain a spread of a virus that is, for all we can tell, extremely deadly and very significant in our culture. When you're discussing these questions, I want you to think that whether you think you want to belong or not, the fact is that most people do actually want to belong to a wider group. It's very normal for humans to want to gather, to share their stories, to spend their time, to make their lives with other humans. And so we move from simply making the marks of a group into building our culture around the togetherness of the crowd, or not. So humans have proved their duality in their actions over time. There's a need to congregate, as we've said, but there's also a need to be alone, actually. I think what's happening in the world now, maybe more than ever, forces us to be alone in a way we don't like, but at the same time, we definitely do need space in order to process what's happening around us. And again, how does art deal with any of that? What happens when the crowd is disbanded? What happens when humans don't get what they want? We see this all the time at the moment. People really rallying against what they're essentially being ordered to do. And again, as artists or consumers of art, we could look back over the wide art history, especially in Western art, and we could say that there have been many different periods in history where factionism, divisiveness, war has been depicted in a way that shows how humans are kind of tortured by their culture. I was looking at how artists are starting to respond to the pandemic. And if you do a quick Google search, you come up with probably lots of particularly street art. Very often street art is the way in which we commune most directly to immediate culture, or it's the immediate response to something that's happening. Usually the first port of call will be Instagram and Twitter. People are constantly chatting or photographing things and putting them up on social media platforms. There's an immediate access now to what's happening locally and globally in a way that is unprecedented, that we've never had before in human history. But still, even though those things in one way are quite kind of ephemeral and impermanent, the fact is that we still do have artists making work that is physical. So I was looking particularly at this work. It's a street artist called Lionel Stanhope. He's working in London, and he's recreated the very famous Caravaggio painting called Supper at Emmaus. Again, some of you who've studied with me have probably seen this original Caravaggio painting many times. It's one of my favourite. I think it's a very, very beautiful painting. But Stanhope's reinterpreting it for modern times. He's kind of imagining what Caravaggio would do were he alive now. And I do wonder what Caravaggio would feel if he were alive now and painting now. If, again, we go back to this idea that we are making art in response to our human concerns that are relevant now, the point of now, then of course it makes sense that in 2020, art depicts something about the pandemic, art depicts something about our fear, art depicts something that represents a shift away from individualism into being a collective. Or indeed having been a collective and then being disbanded because we're not allowed to gather. I do wonder if Caravaggio would have responded in a really similar way to Stanhope. And also what's really good about this, I think, in another way, is that for a lot of art, and maybe sadly, we have to go to fancy galleries in order to consume it or to see it, if we want to see it in its physical reality. But actually Stanhope's just working out on the street. This is proper street art. This is a mural. It's painted very large on a wall under some arches in southwest London, or southeast London rather, and you can go and see it. And the fact is that galleries have been closed and locked down, and here we are, we still have access to art. In that way, art also is a great leveller. There's a real democratization of art through this kind of art making. And actually, as we move forward in time, whatever our descendants are going to think of us and our pandemic and our response to it, the fact is that also the beginning of the 21st century has seen an explosion of access to art, the way we are able to see it, to participate in it, to be part of it, and to know it and understand it. I'd like you to discuss if you think Caravaggio would respond in a similar way. I mean, the figure of Christ there has got his blue latex gloves on. Obviously, they're not observing social distancing, naughty early Christians. But also, when we look across any paintings, really, sometimes we can look at old paintings and we think they're not relevant to us. They don't have things in them that are important to us. They don't make sense to us. We can actually think that a lot of old paintings are quite boring. We might appreciate them technically, but maybe contextually we don't get them, or we don't think they're relevant. But I would argue that there's so many paintings from across art history, especially Western art history, where we see the behaviour of humans, and it is exactly the same behaviour that humans are still part of now. So, the battle between Carnival and Lent, for example, by Bruegel, is really a depiction of this duality that I've spoken of already, this sense that we want stuff but we can't have it. We are driven kind of mad by our desires, yet we're tamed by our moralities. And I've put here, art is often allegorical. And I want you to question, might we too be facing the same concerns as those humans of 500 years ago? You know, the image I've put there, I think it's from BBC News. It's a protest about COVID lockdown. In Bruegel's painting, we had people who were essentially maybe not protesting with placards, but certainly out on the streets, participating in some kind of collective movement where some people think one thing and other people think another. And that element of human behaviour has always been scrutinised by art and artists. And I think it's fascinating to consider whether our 2020 vision of humanity, our being, our seeing, and then ultimately our recording, really will reflect something similar for the people of the future. So Bruegel's work is an allegorical vision of morality, really, in context of his place in time. And yet, can we say that we too are facing the same concerns? I'd really love you to discuss that as a class if you're in school, but also to think about that more widely. And then really for those of you in school, probably the last slide for us to think about on Monday morning is this painting by Renoir, very famous, Le Moulin de la Galette. These people, they're just being people. They're socializing, they're laughing, they're dancing, they're talking to each other, conversing, they're flirting, they're building relationships, they're probably falling out. There's maybe a bit of drama somewhere in there. But there's certainly a feeling of togetherness. Are the people represented by Renoir here any different to us? If you think about any social gathering in those days when we were allowed to gather in groups of more than 6, in and out of each other's houses all the time, do we behave essentially in the same way as humans really have always behaved? This sense that we want to be liked, we want to be popular, that we want to have human contact, that people will always like the look of each other, there'll always be flirtations, there'll always be little scandals, there'll always be dancing and music. I'd like you to discuss the similarities and differences between humans then and now as much as you can. And if you think of the painting that Renoir's painted, we're looking at something that was really like a snapshot taken for us in painted form in 1876 in France. So in terms of history, not that long ago really, and certainly culturally very similar to the culture we may think of as being historically British. The specific concerns might be particular, of course, to Paris in the late 19th century. But are these characters people we may well encounter now? And also, the last thing to really think about is much the same as Caravaggio with his Supper at Emmaus. If Renoir were alive now, and he were with us painting, responding to culture as it is today, how would he paint this now? What would it look like? What would be the changes? What would still be the same? So what might we see instead or in addition to the existing imagery? If you're with me in school, now is a really good time to pause the video and go through the questions again. And to move on, thinking very much about really how we do transpose something that is historical from the past into something that responds to now, perhaps for the benefit of the future. I'd really like you to discuss the work that we're going to see coming up in context as much as you can. You're going to look at the dates of the paintings I'm going to show you, and we're going to think about their existing symbolism, whatever symbols are in those paintings, and then think about equivalencies. You know, are our symbols now the same as the symbols from 500 years ago? Are our concerns now the same as those concerns from 200 years ago? So, if you're in class, your tutors have got paper copies of these as well that they can scroll all over, and you can adapt, you can collage on top of them, you can draw on top of them. You might want to give them out within the class and somehow adapt them in small groups. The first painting is The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. It adorns the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican City in Rome. It was painted between 1508 and 1512. Took him a long time to complete. High up on his scaffold, the beautiful ceiling that we can go and visit if we're ever lucky enough to go to Rome. I'm going to read you just what it says in Wikipedia, because I think that does give us the best kind of overview of what this painting represents. It says, The Creation of Adam is a fresco painting. So that means it's painted into wet plaster, so the pigment is really, really vibrant. By Italian artist Michelangelo, one of the most famous artists of all time in the West. and it forms part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It illustrates the biblical creation narrative from the book of Genesis, in which God gives life to Adam, the first man. The fresco is part of a complex iconographic scheme and is chronologically the fourth in the series of panels depicting episodes from Genesis. So that's an Old Testament book, the Bible. The image of the near-touching hands of God and Adam has become iconic of humanity. It's been reproduced countless times. There's loads of imitations of this painting. You'll have seen this a million times in lots of different forms, maybe even on socks or on umbrellas, everywhere. And it's one of the most replicated religious paintings of all time as well. Now, if we were to do what Stanhope did with Supper at Emmaus, and we were to think about adapting this painting to suit contemporary life, or indeed if we were to imagine that Michelangelo were transported to 2020 from the early 16th century in his robes, how would he paint it? We live in the middle of a global pandemic, a period of enormous human suffering that in some way, for most people who are alive now, we don't necessarily recollect what it was like to live through a war that came actually to our shores. And so this, for many of us, is our first real experience of something that impacts on a global scale the lives of everybody. I was wondering, in terms of prompting the thoughts about this and how it would otherwise be depicted for the 2020 audience, would they even be able to touch hands? The representation of God here, he looks quite old. Should he not be at home shielding? And who would Adam be? Who would Adam actually be? Would he be some kind of YouTube celebrity? I wonder, would God want to create Adam at the height of a pandemic? So, an example. If you're in school, you might want to pause the video now and think about this as a class. Next, painting most commonly known as Whistler's Mother. I'm going to again read from Wikipedia so you get a little bit of context. Arrangement in grey and black, which is best known under its colloquial name Whistler's Mother, is a painting in oils on canvas created by the American-born painter James McNeill Whistler in 1871. The subject of the painting is Whistler's mother, Anna McNeill Whistler. It's one of the most famous works by an American artist outside the United States, and it's been variously described as an American icon and a Victorian Mona Lisa. Several unverifiable stories relate to the painting of the work, and one is that Anna Whistler acted as a replacement for another model who couldn't make the appointment. It's also said that Whistler originally envisioned painting the model standing up, but that his mother was too uncomfortable to pose standing for an extended period. Now, armed with all that information, if we were to reinterpret this for 2020 and respond to it as all art does to the cultural values of now, we might question straight away, did the other model not turn up because she was sick? Is Whistler's mother sitting down because she's so exhausted in the recovery period from COVID? And is Whistler himself, the artist, somewhere in the room just out of sight because they're socially distancing and she's shielding because she's so old? There are lots of ways that we could play with this. We could think about it, we could quite simply think about her wearing a mask. Instead of having a lace bonnet, why not a lace mask? We could think about her, instead of her Victorian black garb, we could think of her wearing some kind of boiler suit or hazmat suit. We could think of all kinds of ways in which we would adapt this to respond somehow to what we're going through now. And likewise, when we look at a painting like The Scream, again very famous, Edvard Munch from 1893, again, art that travels across time and still has an impact in its original or inceptive meaning. This is a painting about anguish. in living memory, have we had a period of greater anguish than now? I mean, we could go into this painting again in the same way we have with the others, and we could say, well, of course, the figure, we could put a mask on it, we could say that the people further along the pier are socially distant, all that kind of stuff, but that's actually becoming quite superficial when we look at a painting like this. Again, Wikipedia has been my friend. I'm going to redirect to you from it to tell you about the painting. The Scream is the popular name given to a composition created by Norwegian expressionist artist Edvard Munch in 1893. The original German title given by Munch to his work was Der Schrei der Natur, which is the scream of nature. And the Norwegian title is Skrik, which is shriek, so a scream, basically. The agonised face in the painting has become one of the most iconic images of art, seen as symbolising the anxiety of the human condition. Munch recalled that he had been out for a walk at sunset when suddenly the setting sunlight turned the clouds a blood red, and he sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. Scholars have located the spot to a fjord overlooking Oslo, and have suggested other explanations for the unnaturally orange sky, ranging from the effects of a volcanic eruption to a psychological reaction by Munch to his sister's commitment at a nearby lunatic asylum. So here we have an artist responding to the immediate surroundings, the immediate context of his life. But actually, I think if Munch were painting now, he probably would paint exactly the same image. Again, in your classes, please discuss this. This is maybe a timeless image of something about humanity, about our human anguish, our anxiety. And I suppose to counter that, I thought of Rembrandt's well-loved, probably best known, The Night Watch from 1642. It is a painting of kind of pomp and ceremony. It's a painting that, again, as in all the others, shows off the artist's particular style and skill. And it records something that would have been important in context of the culture of Rembrandt in Holland in 1642. This is what it says in Wikipedia. The painting is famous for three things. Its colossal size, so it's really, really big painting, and the dramatic use of light and shadow, and the perception of motion in what would traditionally have been a static military group portrait. So this painting is showing us a kind of dynamism of movement within a group of people who are basically militiamen. They are there to uphold the law, the doctrine of the day. The painting was completed in 1642 at the peak of the Dutch Golden Age, so a period of Dutch history in which they really were kind of conquering the world, I guess, in terms especially of trade, travelling to far-flung destinations, bringing back the riches and treasures from far, far away. Again, in 1642, it's not like you could hop on an airplane. This was all seafaring trade. But even for us, again, in thinking in contemporary terms, we can't actually just hop on a plane now either to get to our treasures and our riches. But really what I wanted to think about is there's lots of symbolism in this painting. There's a woman in the back and she's got the claws of a chicken. There are lots of things we could read into that about kind of overcoming an enemy or somehow triumphing over an enemy. There are lots of people moving again, kind of into the foreground, into the space where the audience might be. You imagine our descendants looking at a painting from now in which a mass of people who are perhaps quite triumphant over something move into this space. And I wonder, if Rembrandt were alive now, would he be painting in a hopeful way about triumphing over COVID, for example? I'd like you to think what the symbols of today might be. As a group, you could discuss it. Think across all of these artists, across all of these paintings that I've shared with you, What are the kind of moments, spaces, objects, and of course, generally symbols that say something about our concerns? How do we interject them into the paintings of the past? How might we make new work as artists, or indeed look at work by contemporary or current artists that somehow helps us feel cared for at a time in the world where maybe we do really need to stick together? Anyway, please do discuss, annotate across the paintings. Think very much about how our life now is going to be preserved for the future by artists, and what our life now might look like for our descendants, in much the same way that we can look into the past and try and surmise something about our ancestors. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do. Good luck.